In a small, quiet town, where everyone seems to know each other, something terrible happened. It was a day like any other, but for one family, life would never be the same. Brian Kingston, a loving father and well-respected member of the community, was found dead in his own home. What made this even more shocking was that Brian had no enemies, or at least that's what everyone thought. At first glance, Brian's life seemed perfect: a nice house, a good job, and a beautiful family. But hidden behind the happy family photos was a secret no one could have guessed. There were problems within the Kingston household, and they were bigger than anyone imagined. On the day of his murder, nothing seemed unusual. Brian went about his normal routine, but by the end of the day he was found dead, leaving everyone wondering who could have done this. Was it a break-in gone wrong, or was the danger much closer to home? The police were called, and Detective Mark Phillips was put in charge of the case. What he uncovered would shock the entire town. Family members, close friends, even the neighbors all became suspects. As secrets started to surface, the truth behind Brian's death became more and more twisted. Stay with us as we walk through every detail, from the day Brian Kingston was murdered to the shocking discovery that changed everything. Brian Kingston lived a seemingly normal life in a small town where everyone knew each other. He was 45 years old and worked as a manager at a local hardware store. His wife, Julia, was 42 and worked part-time at a nearby library. They had one son, Daniel, who was 19 and had just started college. From the outside, the Kingston family appeared perfect: a modest, happy family with no visible problems. Brian was well-liked in the community. He had a friendly smile for everyone and often helped his neighbors with small projects or yard work. He was the kind of man who would stop to talk to people at the grocery store or wave at passers-by while mowing the lawn. Julia, too, was admired. She was quiet but kind, always willing to lend a hand at community events or bake for charity drives. Their son, Daniel, was quiet and reserved. He had friends, but he mostly kept to himself. He was often seen wearing headphones, absorbed in his own world. But behind closed doors, the Kingstons had their problems, like any family. Brian and Julia's marriage wasn't as perfect as it looked from the outside. They had been arguing more frequently, though nothing too serious, at least to the outside world. Daniel had always been a bit distant, and though he didn't cause any trouble, there was something about him that felt off to those who paid close attention. One weekend, a Saturday to be exact, everything changed. The day started like any other. Brian left the house early to run some errands. Julia stayed home, and Daniel was out with his friends. By mid-afternoon, Brian had returned home. He planned to spend the evening with his family, maybe watch a movie or just relax. It was a warm day, and the windows were open, letting in the soft breeze. But that evening, Brian didn't come out of his office. He had a small room in the back of the house where he liked to sit and unwind. Julia didn't think much of it at first. She assumed he was doing paperwork or just needed some alone time. Hours passed, and still, Brian hadn't emerged. When Julia went to check on him, she found him sitting in his chair, slumped over the desk, motionless. At first, she thought he had fallen asleep. She called his name softly, but there was no response. Then she shook his shoulder gently, but he didn't move. Panic began to set in as she realized something was terribly wrong. His skin felt cold to the touch, and she noticed a strange mark around his neck, a deep bruise that looked almost like a rope burn. Julia screamed and called 911 immediately. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Brian was dead. The house filled with flashing lights as police and investigators swarmed the scene. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering among themselves. No one could believe what had happened. Brian Kingston, the friendly, helpful man everyone knew, was dead, and it didn't look like an accident. The investigation begins. Detective Mark Phillips arrived on the scene shortly after. He was a seasoned detective, around 50 years old, with years of experience handling cases like this. He had seen plenty of deaths, but something about this case felt different right from the start. The bruising around Brian's neck suggested foul play, and the fact that no one had heard or seen anything unusual made the situation even more puzzling. The initial investigation didn't reveal much. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, and no one in the house seemed to have heard any struggle. Julia was understandably distraught, and Daniel seemed shocked, though his reaction was quieter. He sat in the living room, staring at the floor, barely speaking to anyone. Detective Phillips began by questioning Julia. She explained that she had been in the kitchen most of the evening, preparing dinner. She hadn't noticed anything unusual until she went to check on Brian. Her account seemed straightforward, but there were no answers as to how or why this could have happened. When asked about any problems Brian might have had or if he had any enemies, Julia couldn't think of anyone. Brian was well liked, and as far as she knew, there were no issues that could lead to something like this. Daniel was next. He seemed distant, as always. He told the detective that he had been out with friends most of the day and didn't notice anything unusual when he got home. He hadn't checked on his father and didn't know anything was wrong until his mother started screaming. Detective Phillips noted Daniel's calm demeanor but chalked it up to shock. Sometimes people reacted in strange ways in situations like this. As the investigation continued, the police looked into Brian's personal life, hoping to find some clue. They checked his phone, his computer, and his bank accounts, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Brian didn't have any significant debts, and there were no suspicious communications or activity. It was as if Brian had simply sat down in his office and died, but the bruising around his neck told a different story. The autopsy confirmed what everyone suspected: Brian had been strangled. But who could have done it and why? There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, and no indication that anyone had been in the house, besides Julia and Daniel. The lack of evidence was frustrating. The detectives were stumped. Neighbors were questioned, but no one had seen anything unusual. One neighbor, Greg Walker, had seen Brian earlier in the day, mowing the lawn, but after that, nothing. Greg described Brian as friendly, someone who wouldn't have enemies. Like everyone else, Greg was shocked that something like this could happen in their quiet neighborhood. With no leads and no suspects, the case seemed to stall. But Detective Phillips wasn't ready to give up. He knew that in cases like this, the answers were often closer than anyone expected. He began looking deeper into the family's dynamics, hoping to find something that might explain the crime. Julia's grief seemed genuine, but there was something about Daniel that bothered the detective. The boy had always been distant, but his reaction to his father's death seemed colder than expected. Phillips decided to dig into Daniel's past, looking for anything that might explain his behavior. What he found surprised him. Daniel had a troubled past, something that had been carefully hidden from the outside world. He had struggled with anger issues throughout his teenage years, and had even been in trouble with the law a few times, though nothing serious. There had been fights at school, incidents of vandalism, and rumors of drug use, though nothing had ever been proven. These revelations painted a different picture of the Kingston family, one that didn't match the perfect image they had shown to the outside world. Julia had worked hard to keep her son's troubles hidden, but now it seemed that those secrets might be the key to solving the case. Detective Phillips brought Daniel in for another round of questioning, this time focusing more on his relationship with his father. Daniel was reluctant to talk, but the detective's persistence eventually paid off. Daniel admitted that his relationship with Brian had been strained for years. They argued often, mostly about Daniel's behavior and his future. Brian had high expectations for his son, and Daniel felt like he could never live up to them. As the interrogation continued, Daniel's calm exterior began to crack. He became defensive, his answers shorter and more aggressive. Phillips pressed harder, asking if the argument had escalated the night Brian died. Daniel denied it at first, but his demeanor suggested there was more to the story. The detective began to suspect that the motive for Brian's murder might not be some outside threat but something much closer to home. Could Daniel have been pushed to the breaking point by years of pressure and frustration? It was a possibility Phillips couldn't ignore. But without concrete evidence, the case remained open, with more questions than answers. As the investigation moved forward, Detective Phillips knew he had to get to the bottom of the strained relationship between Brian and Daniel. Despite the lack of concrete evidence tying Daniel to the crime, the tension between father and son couldn't be ignored. The detective decided it was time to take a deeper look at the Kingston family, beyond what was immediately visible to the public. The first thing Phillips uncovered was that the Kingstons were not as financially secure as they appeared. Brian's job at the hardware store paid decently, but it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle the family seemed to have. There were credit card debts, unpaid bills, and a mortgage that was falling behind. This financial pressure weighed heavily on Brian, and it often led to arguments between him and Julia. Brian had been feeling the strain of supporting his family, and the stress had made him irritable and short-tempered, particularly with Daniel. Phillips also discovered that Daniel wasn't the model student people thought he was. Despite starting college, Daniel's academic performance had been slipping for years. He was barely passing his classes, and there had been several disciplinary issues at school that the family had kept hidden from the community. Teachers had noted that Daniel often seemed distracted, disinterested, and even aggressive when things didn't go his way. These issues at school had caused many fights between Daniel and his parents, particularly Brian, who had high hopes for his son's future. Phillips began to consider whether the pressure Daniel felt from his father could have led to something far more serious than just an argument. With the tension building between father and son, had it been possible that a moment of anger and frustration had escalated into violence? The detective also looked into Daniel's social life. He had a small group of friends, most of whom were known to the police for minor infractions like vandalism and underage drinking. Daniel had always been somewhat of a follower in this group, never the leader but always there when trouble happened. It seemed that Daniel was looking for an outlet to escape the pressure at home, and these friends provided that escape, even if it was leading him down a dangerous path. One night, Phillips decided to bring Daniel in for another round of questioning, this time more focused on his recent behavior and activities. The detective asked him about his friends, his school life, and most importantly, his relationship with his father. At first, Daniel remained calm, giving short, measured answers. But as the questions became more pointed, his composure started to crack. Phillips pressed him about the night of his father's death, asking again where he had been and what he had seen when he came home. Daniel repeated his original story. He had come home late, gone straight to his room, and didn't notice anything unusual until his mother screamed. But Phillips didn't believe him. He knew something was being left out, and the more he questioned Daniel, the more nervous the boy became. Eventually, Daniel broke down. His voice trembled as he admitted that he and his father had argued that evening. The argument, Daniel explained, had started over something small. Brian had found out that Daniel was failing one of his college courses. The argument quickly escalated, as it often did, with Brian yelling at Daniel about his future and how he wasn't living up to expectations. Daniel had stormed out of the house after the fight, going to a friend's house to cool off. He insisted that when he came back, he found his father dead just like his mother had. Phillips listened carefully to Daniel's story. While it explained the bruising on Brian's neck, it still didn't account for everything. How had Brian been strangled without a struggle? Why were there no signs of anyone else being in the house? And most importantly, why was Daniel so calm in the face of such a tragedy? After this confession, Phillips knew he had to dig deeper into Daniel's mental state. The detective requested access to Daniel's medical records with Julia's permission. What he found was disturbing. Daniel had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression for years. He had been in therapy for a time as a teenager but had stopped going once he turned 18, refusing to continue. He had been prescribed medication to help manage his mood swings, but according to his records, he had stopped taking the pills months ago. Phillips wondered if this untreated mental health condition had played a role in the crime. Was it possible that, in a moment of rage, Daniel had lashed out at his father and done something he couldn't take back? As the investigation continued, Phillips began to focus more on the psychological aspect of the case. He interviewed Daniel's friends, teachers, and even his former therapist, trying to build a picture of the young man's emotional state leading up to the murder. What he found was a young man under intense pressure, both from his family and from himself. Daniel had always felt like he was living in his father's shadow, never able to measure up to Brian's expectations. The pressure had built up over time, until something finally snapped. Phillips now believed that Daniel was directly involved in his father's death. The only question was whether it had been premeditated or a moment of uncontrollable rage. Either way, the detective knew he was close to the truth. As Detective Phillips continued to unravel the case, he knew that he had to get Daniel to open up further. But getting the full truth out of Daniel would take more than just standard questioning. He needed to create an environment where Daniel would feel compelled to reveal what had really happened that night. Phillips started by speaking to Julia again. He gently probed her about the family dynamics and how she had seen the relationship between Brian and Daniel unfold over the years. Julia hesitated at first, but eventually admitted that the relationship between her husband and son had been strained for a long time. Brian had always been hard on Daniel, pushing him to excel in school, sports, and later, his college studies. Julia confessed that she often felt caught in the middle, trying to mediate between the two of them but never quite able to bridge the gap. Julia's confession, though heartbreaking, provided Phillips with more insight into the Kingston family. He now had a clearer picture of what had likely happened: years of unspoken resentment and frustration, simmering beneath the surface, until one day it boiled over into violence. With this new information in hand, Phillips decided it was time to bring Daniel in for one final round of questioning. This time Phillips would be more direct, using the information he had gathered to push Daniel into telling the full story. The questioning began like before, with Phillips asking about Daniel's day-to-day life, his friends, and his relationship with his father. But then Phillips asked the question that would change everything: what happened in the moments after the argument between you and your father. Daniel's face paled. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Phillips pressed on, calmly but firmly. He laid out the facts as they stood: the bruising on Brian's neck, the lack of forced entry, the financial troubles, and most importantly, the ongoing tension between Daniel and his father. It was then that Daniel began to break down. He sobbed quietly, and in a barely audible voice, he finally began to talk. According to Daniel, the argument that night had been worse than usual. Brian had been in a particularly bad mood, and when he found out that Daniel had failed another class, he snapped. The yelling escalated quickly, with Brian accusing Daniel of being lazy and ungrateful. Daniel, already on edge from months of pressure and frustration, yelled back, saying things he never thought he'd say to his father. The argument reached its peak when Brian got in Daniel's face, pointing a finger at his chest, and saying something that pushed Daniel over the edge. In a fit of rage, Daniel shoved his father back harder than he intended. Brian stumbled and fell, hitting his head on the edge of the desk in the small office. Dazed, Brian tried to stand, but Daniel, in a panic, grabbed the nearest thing he could find: a belt that had been left draped over the back of the chair, and wrapped it around his father's neck. He didn't mean to kill him, Daniel said. He just wanted him to stop yelling, to stop making him feel worthless. But as soon as he realized what he had done, it was too late. Brian was gone. Daniel sat there for what felt like hours, staring at his father's lifeless body, unsure of what to do. Eventually he left the house, hoping that if he acted like nothing had happened, everything would somehow be okay. But it wasn't, and it never would be. Phillips listened carefully as Daniel recounted the events of that night. The story matched the evidence, and it was clear that Daniel hadn't premeditated the murder. It had been a tragic, impulsive act, born out of years of unresolved tension and emotional turmoil. With Daniel's confession, the case was finally coming to a close. It wasn't the ending that anyone had hoped for, but at least the truth was out. With Daniel's confession in hand, Detective Phillips had the closure he needed for the case. It was a tragic story of a young man who, after years of pressure and unresolved conflict, had finally reached his breaking point. The death of Brian Kingston was not the result of some elaborate plan or outside threat, but rather an impulsive, devastating act fueled by a moment of uncontrollable rage. It was a painful reality for everyone involved, and the consequences were heartbreaking. After the confession, Daniel was formally charged with the murder of his father. The town, which had been shaken by Brian's sudden death, now faced the even more difficult truth: this wasn't the work of a stranger but a crime that had unfolded within the walls of a seemingly perfect family. For the people who knew the Kingstons, it was almost impossible to believe. They had seen Brian mowing his lawn, greeting neighbors, and acting like the model father. Julia had always been kind and quiet, while Daniel was the typical teenager who mostly kept to himself. But behind that facade, there had been growing tension, a storm that no one outside the house had seen coming. As the legal process unfolded, Daniel's defense team argued that the crime had not been premeditated. They presented evidence of Daniel's mental health struggles, the emotional strain he had been under, and the toxic relationship he had with his father. Witnesses spoke of the constant pressure Daniel faced from Brian's high expectations and the conflicts that had been brewing for years. The defense sought leniency, hoping to show that Daniel was not a cold-blooded killer, but a young man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. The prosecution, however, pointed to the fact that Brian had been strangled, a method of killing that required time and intention. They argued that while the crime may not have been premeditated, Daniel had still acted deliberately. He had made the decision to grab the belt, and he had chosen not to stop until it was too late. This, they said, was enough to warrant a severe punishment. In the courtroom, Julia sat quietly, watching as her son's fate was debated. She had lost her husband, and now she was at risk of losing her son as well. The community that had once looked up to the Kingstons as an ideal family now saw them as the center of a tragic and disturbing crime. Julia's grief was twofold: mourning the death of her husband, while also struggling with the realization that her son had been the one responsible. As the trial came to a close, the jury had to decide how much weight to give to Daniel's mental state and the circumstances that had led up to the crime. After days of deliberation, they reached a verdict. Daniel was found guilty of manslaughter, not premeditated murder. While the jury acknowledged that Daniel had acted out of anger and frustration, they also recognized that he had not planned to kill his father beforehand. The charge of manslaughter reflected the belief that it was a crime born out of the heat of the moment. Daniel was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. It was a heavy sentence for someone so young, but it was less than the life sentence he might have faced for a premeditated murder conviction. For many in the community, it was a fair outcome, though the tragedy of the situation left a deep scar. There were no real winners in this case, only a family torn apart by unresolved conflict and a moment of violence that had changed everything. In the months that followed, the town of Littleton slowly began to move on, but the memory of what had happened lingered. The Kingston home remained a quiet, empty reminder of the crime, and neighbors couldn't pass by without thinking about the tragedy that had unfolded there. Julia, having lost both her husband and her son, moved away from the town, unable to bear the weight of the memories. As for Daniel, his time in prison began with reflection and regret. He was given access to counseling, something he had refused before, and he finally began to confront the deep emotional issues that had plagued him for years. While his time behind bars would be long, there was hope that he could eventually rebuild his life, though it would never be the same. The story of Brian Kingston's murder was not just a story about a crime, it was a story about a family under pressure, a young man pushed to his breaking point, and the devastating consequences of unresolved conflict. It served as a reminder to the community that what you see on the outside doesn't always reflect what's happening behind closed doors.